The lawyer wouldn't look at her. Aria noticed it the moment her name was called. Everyone else in that room had received their portion of the estate with at least the dignity of eye contact. Her brother Thomas got the house in Biltmore Forest. Her sister Karen got the investment accounts. Her uncle received the lakefront property near Weaverville. Each name, each asset, each nod of acknowledgement. Clean, practiced, almost rehearsed. Then the lawyer said Aria Campbell and slid a piece of paper across the mahogany table without lifting his eyes from his notes. She picked it up. An address, handwritten, not typed like the rest of the documents, as if someone had added it at the last minute or had hoped until the very end that it wouldn't be necessary. She waited for more. A number, a description, anything. Nothing followed. Her sister Karen made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Her brother Thomas shifted in his seat and suddenly found the ceiling very interesting. The lawyer cleared his throat and moved on to the next item before Aria could form a question. That night she sat in the parking lot of a gas station on the edge of Asheville and typed the address into her phone. The map loaded slowly. The pin dropped not on a neighborhood, not on a street with other houses nearby, but somewhere inside the Pisgah National Forest. No street view available. Just a dirt road that dissolved into green on the satellite image, and somewhere at the end of it, according to her father's handwritten note, something that belonged to her. She didn't sleep. The drive took 40 minutes the next morning. The last 10 were on a road that didn't deserve the name, 2 tire tracks pressed into the earth by years of occasional use, flanked by oak and poplar, so dense the sky almost disappeared. Aria drove slowly, her old Civic scraping the occasional low branch, the forest growing quieter and thicker with every 100 yards. She smelled it before she saw it. Wet wood. Rot. Something older underneath. The particular heaviness of a place that had been sealed from air and people for a very long time. Then the trees opened slightly and she stopped the car. The house was enormous. That was the first thing that hit her. Not the destruction, but the scale. Whatever this place had been, it had been built to last. 2 stories of timber framing, a wide porch now collapsed entirely on one side, a stone chimney rising from the left end of the structure still intact, while everything around it had surrendered. The roof had caved inward at the center, the ridge beams snapped, and both slopes pulling toward each other like hands folding in prayer. Vines had consumed the eastern wall completely. The western wall had a hole in it large enough to walk through without ducking. Aria sat in the car for a long moment. Her father had given her this, not by accident, not as an afterthought buried in a legal document. Handwritten, personal. This specific place, this specific address, her name and nothing else. She got out. The ground was soft underfoot. Years of fallen leaves compressed into something almost sponge-like. She walked the path slowly, eyes moving across the facade, reading the building the way you'd read a face, looking for what it was, trying not to say. The porch steps had rotted through, but the stone foundation held. The front door was still in its frame, which surprised her, warped badly, swollen with moisture, painted once in a color she couldn't identify beneath the grey film of decades, but closed, deliberately closed. She tried the key from the envelope. It didn't turn. She tried again, held the key differently, pushed the door gently while turning. Nothing. Then she noticed the door wasn't locked. It had been sealed. Someone had run a line of cork along the entire doorframe. Old cork, cracked and yellowed, but applied with intention. Someone had stood exactly where Aria stood now and made a decision that this door would not open easily, that whatever was inside would require effort to reach. She found a rusted hand tool in the bed of someone's forgotten work, a flat piece of metal half buried near the foundation stones, and worked the seal slowly, the dried material crumbling in thin strips. The door swung open with a sound like a long exhale. Dark inside. Cool. The smell hit immediately under paper, mildew, something almost medicinal underneath. Aria stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The room was not empty. Furniture still in place, a table, 2 chairs, a wooden cabinet against the far wall with its doors closed. Dust over everything, like a layer of time made visible. And on the table, placed deliberately in the center, not fallen there, not forgotten there, but placed, a single manila envelope, with her name on it. Not her full name, just Aria, written in handwriting she had never seen before. She stepped inside. The floorboards held. Barely in one spot near the window, but they held. She crossed to the table slowly, not touching anything yet, just looking. The envelope was thick, something rigid inside, not just paper. The handwriting was careful, unhurried. Someone who had taken time with each letter. She picked it up, and that was when she heard it. Footsteps outside on the path she had just walked. Someone else knew about this place, and they were walking toward it right now. Who do you think knew about this house before Aria did? Drop your answer in the comments. Aria didn't move. The footsteps weren't hurried. That was the thing that unsettled her most. Not the sound itself, but the pace of it. Unhurried. Familiar. The kind of walk that belongs to someone who has been somewhere before and knows exactly what the ground feels like underfoot. She slipped the envelope under her jacket without thinking. A reflex. Something in her chest made the decision before her mind caught up with it. The door was still open behind her, light cutting through the frame in a long rectangle across the dusty floor. She turned to face it and waited. Lucas Phillips stepped into the doorway. He was wearing a jacket too clean for the forest, dark wool, city jacket, the kind that cost more than Aria's monthly rent. His shoes were wrong too, dress shoes with mud now climbing the sides. He had walked that path without preparing for it, which meant he hadn't planned on walking it, which meant he had followed her. He stopped when he saw her. His expression did something complicated in the space of about 1 second. Surprise first, but not the genuine kind, the performed kind, the kind that arrives slightly too late, like an actor who missed his cue by a breath. "Aria," he said, warm voice, practiced warmth. "I didn't expect to find you here already." She said nothing. He stepped inside without being invited. His eyes moved across the room quickly, the table, the cabinet, the 2 chairs, the floor. She watched him look for the envelope and not find it and look again. "The firm wanted someone to assess the property," he said, still moving his gaze around the room. "Standard procedure after an estate transfer. I should have called ahead. I apologize." "You should have," Aria said. He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Lucas Phillips had been her father's attorney for 11 years. She had met him exactly 4 times. Twice at family events where he appeared briefly and left early, once at a hospital waiting room where he spoke only to her father in low tones near a window, and yesterday at the reading of the will where he had slid her that handwritten address without looking at her. She had never trusted him in a specific way, just the general, low-level unease of someone who smiles too readily and listens too carefully. "What kind of assessment?" she asked. "Structural, environmental, whether the property has any salvageable value." He finally stopped scanning the room and looked at her directly. "Which, honestly, it likely doesn't. The foundation may be compromised. The roof is—" He gestured upward at the collapsed center, obviously a concern. "My father left it to me." "He did. In his handwriting, not typed, not drafted by your office." Something shifted in Lucas's expression. Barely. A tightening around the eyes that he controlled quickly. "That's correct," he said. "He added it late in the process." "How late?" A pause. Short, but real. 2 weeks before he passed. Aria let that sit in the air between them. 2 weeks. Her father had been in the hospital for 6 of his final 8 weeks. Sedated for most of the last 2. She had been there. She knew what those days looked like, what he was capable of, and what he wasn't. Writing a handwritten note and placing it into a legal document required a level of intention that someone 2 weeks from death doesn't arrive at casually. He had wanted her here, specifically her. "I'd like to do the walkthrough alone," she said. Lucas tilted his head slightly. "I understand, but the firm has a responsibility." "To me," Aria said, "the property belongs to me, which means your responsibility is to whatever I ask you to do with it, and I'm asking you to wait outside." The warmth in his expression cooled by a precise degree. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded once, adjusted his jacket, and walked back to the doorway. He stopped at the threshold. "There's not much to find in there, Aria." He said it gently, almost kindly, which was exactly why it felt like a warning. She waited until his footsteps faded down the path, counted to 30, then crossed to the window and looked out through the cracked glass, his figure visible through the trees, standing near her car, phone already at his ear. She pulled the envelope from under her jacket, her name in that careful handwriting. Just Aria. No last name, which meant whoever wrote this either didn't use last names or specifically didn't want to use hers. She opened it. Inside, 3 photographs, a folded letter on thin paper, and beneath those, something she hadn't expected. A second envelope, smaller, sealed with tape that had dried and cracked at the edges. On the front of the smaller envelope, 2 words, in the same handwriting. "Not yet." She set that one aside and looked at the photographs first. The first showed this house, but standing, intact. Painted white, porch furniture visible, flower boxes under the windows, smoke from the chimney. Alive. Someone had lived here, and lived here well. The second photograph showed a woman, standing in front of that same intact house, arms crossed, squinting slightly into the sun, middle-aged in the photo, maybe late 40s, dark hair, strong jaw. Something in the way she held herself, not posed, not performing for the camera, just existing, unapologetically taking up space. Aria had never seen this woman in her life, but something about the jaw, the way the shoulders sat, the specific angle of the head. She turned to the third photograph and stopped breathing. It was her father, younger, much younger, maybe early 30s, hair dark without a trace of grey, standing beside the woman from the second photograph, his hand on her shoulder, her hand covering his. Both of them looking not at the camera but at each other. The way people look at each other when they don't know anyone is watching. Aria sat down in one of the dusty chairs. The wood creaked under her weight, but held. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting was the same throughout. Careful, unhurried, each word considered. The paper was thin, but the ink was dark, deliberately pressed. Someone who wanted this to survive. The letter began with 4 words that made the room feel smaller. Your father had 2 lives. Outside, she heard Lucas end his phone call. His footsteps started back toward the house. If you already suspect who wrote that letter, drop it in the comments. You might be right. You might not be ready for the answer. The letter was 4 pages long. Aria read fast, not because she wanted to rush it, but because Lucas's footsteps were getting closer, and something in her body understood that whatever was on these pages was not meant to be read with him in the room. The handwriting stayed consistent throughout, careful, unhurried, a person who had written this over time, maybe over several sittings, stopping and returning. The kind of letter that gets rewritten until it finally says the thing it was always trying to say. The woman's name was Margaret Elaine Cross. She had met Aria's father when they were both 26. He was working land surveys in the Western Carolina mountains. She was teaching at a small school outside of Asheville. They met at a hardware store on a Tuesday morning, of all places, which Margaret noted with a quiet humor that survived even in a letter written decades later. He knocked over a display rack and she helped him pick up the pieces, and somewhere in that ordinary disaster, something began. They married 14 months later. Not secretly, not hastily. With witnesses, with a certificate, with a reception held in the yard of this exact house, which had been Margaret's family property, inherited from her mother, who had inherited it from hers. The house had stood since before either of them was born. It was solid then. It was theirs. Aria turned the page. For 9 years they lived here. He commuted to work in Asheville. She continued teaching. They built something that had the particular texture of a life that expects to continue. They were not wealthy, but they were not struggling. The letter described mornings on that porch, intact then, flower boxes and coffee and the sound of the forest, with the plainness of someone describing something so familiar it barely needed words. Then he got the job offer. Charlotte, a land development firm. Money that neither of them had ever been close to. A trajectory that pointed away from the mountains and towards something larger, faster, more consuming. Margaret didn't want to go, not because she was afraid, because she understood something about that city and that firm and that version of her husband that he hadn't yet understood about himself. She wrote it plainly. I knew that world would change him. I just didn't know it would replace me. He went anyway. For 6 months he came back on weekends, then every other weekend, then once a month. Then the calls shortened and the silences between them lengthened in the way that silences do when both people know what is happening, but neither is ready to say it. Aria turned the second page. He met someone in Charlotte. The letter didn't use her mother's name. It said only, someone younger, someone from that world, someone who fit the version of himself he was becoming. Margaret wrote it without bitterness, which was somehow harder to read than bitterness would have been. He asked for a divorce. Margaret said yes, but the divorce was never finalized. Aria stopped, read that sentence again. The paperwork was filed. Attorneys were involved, and here the letter paused, and then continued with a precision that felt deliberate. One attorney in particular, who had handled the Campbell family's legal affairs for over a decade, ensured that the finalization was delayed, postponed, rescheduled, until enough time had passed that both parties assumed the other had completed it, until Margaret, living alone in this house, believed it was done, until Aria's father, building his new life in Charlotte, believed it was done. It was not done. When Margaret discovered this, years later, through a land dispute that required her to produce her marriage certificate, she confronted the attorney directly. He told her the error was administrative, clerical. These things happen. She didn't believe him then. She didn't believe him now, writing this letter. Because the attorney she had confronted, the one who had managed the delay, the one who had stood in that office and called it a clerical error, was Lucas Phillips. Aria looked up from the page. Lucas was in the doorway. He wasn't pretending to knock. He wasn't maintaining the performance of courtesy. He stood in the frame and looked at the photographs spread on the table and the letter in Aria's hands, and something in his expression settled into a flatness that was more unsettling than anything he'd shown her before. You read it, he said, not a question. Margaret wrote this, Aria said. He stepped inside. She was a troubled woman, isolated. She had a great deal of difficulty accepting the divorce that was never finalized. Silence. Lucas moved to the table slowly, looked at the photographs without touching them. His jaw was working slightly, the way jaws do when someone is deciding how much to admit and in what order. Your father made decisions, he said carefully. I helped him manage the consequences of those decisions. That is what attorneys do. You falsified a legal process. I managed a transition. The word landed like something rehearsed. a word chosen years ago and kept ready for exactly this conversation. Margaret lived in this house for the rest of her life, Aria said, alone, because the man she married never legally unmarried her, which means every asset my father accumulated after he left, the house in Biltmore, the accounts, the lakefront property, was accumulated inside a marriage that was still legally active. Lucas said nothing. Which means the will, Aria continued, may not be valid. The flatness in his expression didn't crack, but something behind it shifted. That is an interpretation, he said quietly, that would require significant legal resources to pursue. Resources that... His eyes moved briefly to her jacket, to the outline of the small sealed envelope she had replaced there. A person in your position might find difficult to assemble. There it was, not a threat delivered loudly. A threat delivered the way Lucas Phillips delivered everything, quietly, warmly, wrapped in enough plausible meaning that it could always be walked back. Aria stood up. She was not tall, but she took up the space fully. "What's in the second envelope?" she asked. Something moved across his face, fast, gone before she could name it. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Yes, you do." He looked at her for a long moment. The forest was completely silent outside. No wind, no birds. Just the two of them in a dead woman's house with the weight of 30 years pressing down through the rotted ceiling. "Aria," his voice softened deliberately, "your father loved you. Whatever you think you've found here, whatever Margaret may have written in whatever state of mind, it doesn't change what he built for your family. It changes what he built it on," she said. She put the photographs and the letter back in the envelope, tucked it under her jacket next to the smaller one, picked up her bag, walked to the door. "I'd strongly recommend," Lucas said behind her, "that you speak with me before you speak with anyone else." She stopped in the doorway, didn't turn around. "I'd strongly recommend," she said, "that you call whoever you just called on that phone and tell them she read it." She walked out into the forest. Behind her, after a moment, she heard him reach for his phone. The letter named him. Now he knows she knows. What do you think Lucas does next? Tell us in the comments. The number was on the back of the third photograph. Aria almost missed it. She was sitting in her car at the edge of the forest road, engine running, heat slowly pushing back the cold that had settled into her jacket during the walk out. She had the photographs in her lap and was looking at her father's face. That younger version, the one that existed before she did, when she turned the image over and saw it. 7 digits written in pencil, faint, careful, the same handwriting as the letter. Margaret had put it there, not in the envelope, not in the letter, on the back of the photograph that showed Aria's father looking at another woman the way he should have looked at her mother, hidden in the one place that required you to turn something over before you found it. Aria stared at the number for a long moment. Then she dialed. It rang once. "I wondered how long it would take you to get there," the man said. His voice was older, measured, the kind of calm that doesn't come from ease, but from having been through enough that very little surprises you anymore. "Who is this?" Aria said. "Jason Bennett. I was wondering if you'd call the number or open the second envelope first." She gripped the phone tighter. "You know about the envelope." "I know about everything," he said, not with pride, with the exhaustion of someone who's been carrying weight for too long and is finally setting it down. That's the problem. They met that evening at a diner on the south side of Asheville, the kind of place that had been there for 40 years and would be there for 40 more. Vinyl booths, coffee that arrived without asking, a waitress who refilled without interrupting. Jason Bennett was already in the back corner when Aria arrived. He was 62, but looked older in the way that people who have spent decades watching other people's worst decisions tend to look older. Grey stubble, dark jacket, ends around a coffee mug like he needed something to hold on to. He watched her cross the room, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, or something closer to relief. "You look like her," he said when she sat down. "People keep saying that," Aria replied, "because it's true." He turned the coffee mug slowly. Margaret was... She had a specific way of walking into a room, like she'd already decided she belonged there and was just letting everyone else catch up. Aria said nothing. Let him find his way to it. Jason had been hired by her father, not recently, not as he was dying, but years ago. 11 years ago, when Aria was barely 20, and her father was at the height of his career and had apparently decided that loose ends needed managing. Jason was a private investigator, experienced, discreet. He had spent his career doing work that powerful people needed done quietly. The assignment was straightforward on paper. Locate Margaret Cross. Assess her situation. Determine whether she posed any legal or reputational risk to the Campbell estate. Report back. Jason found Margaret in 3 days. She was still in the house, still teaching, though at a different school now, smaller, closer to the forest. Still living the life she had built when she believed the rest of it was behind her. She didn't know about the divorce paperwork that had never been completed. She had assumed for years that she was simply a woman with a complicated past and a quiet present. Jason reported back to Aria's father, and then he did something that ended his career as a for-hire investigator and had cost him sleep every night since. He lied. "I told him I couldn't find her," Jason said. He wasn't looking at Aria when he said it, looking at the table. "Told him she'd moved, left the state, no forwarding information, case closed." The diner hummed around them. Plates scraped, coffee poured. "Why?" Aria said. Jason looked up. "Because she was just living her life." His voice was quiet but not fragile. She wasn't threatening anyone. She wasn't building a case. She was teaching kids and keeping that house together with whatever she had, and she didn't even know she was still legally married to a man who had replaced her and preferred she didn't exist. He paused. "I've done a lot of work I'm not proud of. But I wasn't going to help someone erase a person who didn't know she needed erasing." Aria sat with that. "He believed you," she said. "For a while. Then Lucas Phillips got involved. Lucas had his own contacts, his own methods. Somewhere along the way, he found out I'd lied. Your father confronted me. I returned the money. That was the end of it. But not the end of Margaret. No." Jason reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a manila folder on the table between them. Thick, worn at the edges, the kind of folder that had been opened and closed many times over many years. Not the end of Margaret. Aria looked at the folder without touching it yet. "She contacted me," Jason said. "About 4 years after your father confronted me. She'd finally discovered the divorce was never finalized, the land dispute, like she explained in the letter. She wasn't angry, which surprised me. She was just clear. She knew what had happened. She knew Lucas was involved. She knew the implications for the estate, but she never pursued it. No. Why not?" Jason was quiet for a moment. "She said she didn't want to hurt you." The words landed somewhere Aria wasn't prepared for. She felt them in her chest before she processed them in her head. A woman she had never met, living alone in a forest, holding the legal equivalent of a grenade, and choosing not to pull the pin because of a girl she had never spoken to. "She knew about me," Aria said. "She knew about all 3 of you. Thomas, Karen, you." Jason's hands tightened slightly around the mug. "She said Thomas and Karen were their father's children in every way that mattered to her. But you..." He stopped, chose the next words carefully. "She said you were different. That from what she could tell, you'd always been the one who didn't quite fit the shape your family expected. Aria stared at the folder. "What's in there?" she said. "Everything." Jason pushed it across the table. The original divorce filing, with the dates that prove it was never completed. Communications between Lucas and your father spanning 9 years. Financial records showing asset transfers made after the date the divorce should have been final. Transfers that, given the legal status of the marriage, were made from an estate that wasn't solely your father's to transfer. He paused. And a document Margaret prepared with her own attorney 3 years ago. Not a lawsuit. Not a claim. He met Aria's eyes directly. A transfer of property. The house and the land it sits on, formally signed over to you, registered, legal, completed before she died. Aria opened the folder. The documents were exactly as he described. Clean. Organized. Margaret had been thorough in the particular way of someone who knows they won't be around to explain things and wants to make sure the record speaks for itself. The last page was the property transfer. Aria Campbell. Her full name. Typed. Her father's handwriting on the witness line, which meant he had signed this, which meant he had known, which meant the handwritten address in the will wasn't an afterthought. It was a confession and a direction. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen. Thomas. Then immediately after, Karen. Then a number she didn't recognize. But she had seen it before. In Lucas's hand outside the house, when he thought she couldn't see the screen. They knew she had the folder, or they were about to find out. What do you think Aria should do with what's in that folder? Leave your answer below. Aria didn't answer Thomas, didn't answer Karen, didn't answer the number she recognized as Lucas's. She sat in that booth until Jason finished his coffee and the waitress had refilled hers twice, and the diner had thinned out to just a few scattered tables of people who had nowhere urgent to be. Then she closed the folder, put it in her bag beneath her jacket, and drove across Asheville to a neighborhood she had always associated with a particular kind of silence, the kind that money buys and maintains with careful attention. Brooklyn Morris lived in a house on a wide, tree-lined street where the lawns were kept, with the precision of things that matter to people who need other people to know things matter to them. 2 stories. White columns. A porch with furniture arranged too perfectly to suggest anyone actually sat there. Aria had been inside twice in her life. Both times she had felt like a guest in a museum, allowed to look, not to touch. She rang the bell at 8:47 in the evening. The light in the front room was on. She had seen it from the street. Brooklyn opened the door before the second ring. She was dressed as if she had been expecting company that hadn't confirmed. Dark slacks, a grey blouse, hair set with the kind of effort that looks effortless only to people who don't know what effort looks like. She was 58 and wore it the way certain women do, not fighting it, not performing youth, just occupying the age with a deliberate authority. She looked at Aria in the doorway, and she said, "I knew this day would come. I just didn't think it would be you. Not Thomas, not Karen, not a lawyer or a journalist or a court clerk. You." Aria stepped inside without being invited. Brooklyn moved back to let her, which meant she had decided, somewhere between the bell and the door, not to perform surprise. The front room was warm, a fire going despite the season being barely cold enough to justify it. 2 glasses on the coffee table, one used, one not, which meant Brooklyn had been sitting alone with a drink and had set a second glass out at some point during the evening. Waiting. Aria sat down across from her without removing her jacket. "You knew about Margaret," Aria said. Brooklyn settled into her chair slowly. Not the movement of someone caught, the movement of someone finally allowed to stop holding something up. "I knew about Margaret before your mother did," Brooklyn said, "before your father married her, before any of it became what it became." Aria said nothing. Let the woman find her own way into it. Brooklyn had been her father's older sister's closest friend, not family by blood, not family by law, but the kind of adjacent family that accumulates over decades of proximity and shared history until the distinction stops mattering. She had been present at the original wedding, the one in the yard of the house in the forest. She had stood there in the summer heat and watched two people marry each other with the particular confidence of people who believe they are building something permanent. She had liked Margaret. That was the part that had cost her the most, she said. Not the deception afterward, not the silence she kept, but the fact that she had genuinely liked the woman and then had allowed herself to be positioned on the wrong side of her. "When did you find out about the divorce?" Aria said. "When it didn't happen," Brooklyn said plainly. "Your father called me. He wasn't proud of it. He said Lucas had handled it, and it was taking longer than expected, and he needed someone to know in case anything ever surfaced." She paused. "I think he needed to confess it to someone without it being a confession. And you kept it." "I kept it." No defensiveness in her voice, just fact. "I told myself it was protecting the family, that Margaret had moved on, that the disruption would only hurt people who hadn't done anything wrong." She looked at the fire. "I told myself that for a long time. It gets easier to believe the longer you tell it." "Thomas and Karen," Aria said. "Do they know?" "Thomas suspects something. He doesn't know what. Karen—" Brooklyn's mouth tightened slightly. "Karen has never wanted to know anything that would require her to change her understanding of your father." Aria opened her bag and placed the folder on the coffee table between them. Brooklyn looked at it, didn't reach for it. "Margaret's," she said quietly. "Jason Bennett kept it." Something crossed Brooklyn's face at the name. Respect, maybe, or recognition of a debt. "He was a good man in a situation that didn't reward being good," she said. "He lied to my father. He protected a woman who had done nothing wrong." Brooklyn finally reached forward and touched the edge of the folder without opening it. "Those two things can both be true." Aria leaned forward slightly. "The will isn't valid," she said. "You know that. Lucas knows that. Thomas's house, Karen's accounts, the lakefront property, all of it was transferred from an estate that legally belonged to two people, not one. Every asset my father accumulated after leaving Margaret was accumulated inside a marriage that was never dissolved." Brooklyn was quiet. "Which means the entire distribution can be contested," Aria continued, "which means I could take this folder to an attorney tomorrow morning, and by the end of the week, every member of this family would be receiving correspondence they don't want to receive." The fire popped softly. Brooklyn looked at her with an expression that had moved past calculation into something older and more tired. "Is that what you're going to do?" she said. And Aria realized it wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question. The question of a woman who had spent decades making choices she regretted and was now watching someone younger stand at the same fork in the road. "I don't know yet," Aria said honestly. Brooklyn nodded slowly. Then she reached into the pocket of her slacks and placed something on the coffee table beside the folder. A key. Old. Different from the one in Aria's envelope. "There's a storage unit," Brooklyn said. "On the east side of town. Your father rented it the year before he died. He told me about it and gave me the spare key and told me to give it to whoever came asking the right questions." Aria looked at the key. "What's in it?" she said. Brooklyn picked up her glass. "Everything he couldn't put in the will," she said. "Everything he couldn't say out loud. Everything he spent the last year of his life trying to figure out how to leave behind, without destroying people he still loved." She looked at Aria directly. He knew the will was compromised. He knew Lucas had built something that couldn't hold. And he knew that of his 3 children, only one of them would walk into that forest instead of hiring someone else to do it. The fire burned low between them. "He was counting on you," Brooklyn said quietly. Not to burn it down, to decide what deserved to survive. Aria picked up the key. Outside, a car slowed on the street. Headlights swept across the front window. Didn't stop, but didn't accelerate normally either. Lucas, or someone Lucas had sent. The folder, the key, the letter, the sealed envelope she still hadn't opened. All of it suddenly felt very heavy and very visible. She had until morning before this moved faster than she could manage it. What do you think Aria's father left in that storage unit? Leave your best guess below. Someone's going to be right. Aria drove to the storage facility at 9:10. She didn't go home first. Didn't change clothes, didn't eat, didn't sit somewhere quiet and think through the rational sequence of steps a careful person would take. Careful hadn't gotten her anywhere. Careful was what her family had been doing for 30 years, and look at what Careful had built. A rotted house in the forest and a folder full of documents that nobody wanted to exist. The facility was on the east side of town, off a commercial strip that mixed auto shops with storage units and late-night convenience stores. Orange lights over rows of corrugated metal doors. A keypad entry that Brooklyn had given her the code for on a slip of paper pressed into her palm at the door. The kind of place that asked no questions because its entire business model depended on not asking questions. Unit 114. She found it at the end of the third row. Standard size. Padlock, not digital. The key Brooklyn had given her was small and old and fit perfectly. The door rolled up with a sound like a slow exhale. Inside, not chaos. Not the accumulated disorder of someone who had thrown things in without thinking. The unit was organized with the particular care of someone who knew they were running out of time and wanted the person coming after them to be able to find things without confusion. 3 plastic storage bins, labeled in her father's handwriting. A folding chair, a small table, and on the table, positioned at the center, a laptop. Old, deliberately left open, power cable snaking to a strip on the floor. The screen was dark, but when Aria touched the trackpad, it woke immediately. A single video file on the desktop. The file name was her name, just Aria. Again. The same way Margaret had written it on the envelope. She thought about that for a moment. 2 people who had never shared space, both choosing to address her with just her first name. Both knowing something about her that she was only now beginning to understand about herself. She sat down in the folding chair and pressed play. Her father appeared on screen. He was thinner than she remembered him at the end. This had been filmed maybe 8 months before he died. She could tell by the particular quality of the light and the way he was sitting, upright but with effort. The effort of a man whose body was beginning to cost him more than it used to. He was wearing a dark shirt, no jacket. He looked directly at the camera with an expression she had never seen on him in life. Not the authority he wore at family gatherings, not the carefully managed warmth he deployed at appropriate moments. Just a man sitting in a folding chair in a storage unit, trying to figure out how to tell the truth. He was quiet for the first few seconds, collecting himself or deciding where to start. Then he said, "I need to tell you why I gave you the house." Aria pressed her hands flat against her thighs. "Not because it was worthless," he continued, "because it was the only thing I owned that was entirely honest. Everything else I built, the house your brother lives in, the money Karen has, the property, the accounts, all of it was built on something I never corrected. Something I let Lucas manage because correcting it would have cost me things I wasn't willing to lose." He paused. "That's not an excuse, that's just what it was." He explained the divorce, calmly, completely. No different from what Margaret's letter had said, but hearing it in his voice made it different in a way Aria couldn't quite name. Margaret's letter had been the account of someone wronged. This was the account of someone who had done the wronging and had spent years finding ways not to look directly at it. He talked about Lucas, about how what had started as a legal delay had become a structure. a set of arrangements and silences and managed distances that required ongoing maintenance. Lucas hadn't just failed to file paperwork. He had actively kept the divorce unresolved because an unresolved divorce gave him leverage over Aria's father, over the estate, over everything that came after. "I didn't understand that at first," her father said. "By the time I did, too much had been built on top of it. I told myself Margaret had moved on, that the harm was done, and reopening it would only create new harm." He looked directly into the camera. "I was a coward. That's the accurate word, and I'm using it." He leaned forward slightly. "In the second bin, on the left side, there's a sealed document from my personal attorney. Not Lucas. Someone Lucas doesn't know about. It establishes a legal framework that protects the house and the land from any claim Lucas or the estate might make against it. The property is yours cleanly. Margaret made sure of that, and I confirmed it." Aria glanced at the bin, looked back at the screen. "The third bin has communications, everything between me and Lucas over 11 years, documented, dated, authenticated." His jaw tightened, enough to end his career and potentially his freedom. "I'm not telling you to use it. I'm telling you it exists, and it's yours to decide what to do with." He sat back, was quiet again for a moment. "The small envelope," he said then, "the one that says not yet." Aria's hand moved instinctively to her jacket. "Open it when you've seen everything else," he said. "Not before. I need you to understand the whole shape of it before you read what's in there, because what's in there isn't about the estate or Margaret or Lucas." He stopped, seemed to choose the next words with more care than anything preceding them. "It's about why you were always different from your brother and sister, and why that was never an accident." The video ended. Aria sat in the folding chair in the orange-lit storage unit, with the forest still on her jacket, and the folder in her bag, and a sealed envelope in her pocket, and the particular silence of a person who has just had the ground beneath them shift in a direction they can't yet name. She opened the second bin. The document was exactly where he said it would be. Clean, legal, signed by an attorney she didn't recognize, notarized, registered. The house was hers without condition or contest. She opened the third bin. The communications were extensive, printed, organized chronologically, flagged with colored tabs. 11 years of a relationship between her father and Lucas Phillips that was less attorney and client than it was captor and captive. Lucas holding the unresolved marriage like a key to a lock he never fully turned, maintaining proximity, extracting favors, positioning himself deeper into the estate's structure with every passing year. It was, she thought, the most patient kind of corruption, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that waits. Her phone lit up on the table. "Jason Bennett," she answered. "Lucas filed an emergency injunction an hour ago," Jason said without preamble. "He's claiming the property transfer to you is fraudulent, says Margaret was not of sound mind. He's moving fast because he knows what's in that unit." "How does he know about the unit?" A pause. "Because he had your father followed in the last year of his life," Jason said. "He knew the unit existed. He just never had legal access to it." Another pause. "He does now. Emergency order. You have maybe until tomorrow morning." Aria looked at the 3 bins, at the laptop, at the folder in her bag. "Can he get in here tonight?" she said. "Not legally." "But Aria..." Jason's voice carried something heavier than urgency. "Lucas hasn't operated legally in 11 years. I wouldn't count on tonight being different." She stood up, looked at everything her father had left her. "The whole shape of it," he had said. "Understand the whole shape of it before you open the last envelope." She understood it now. She reached into her jacket, pulled out the small sealed envelope. Not yet, but yet had arrived. She broke the seal. "We're almost at the end. Whatever you think is in that envelope, drop it below. The final answer arrives next chapter." The envelope contained 2 things. Aria registered that before she registered what either of them was. just the physical fact of two folded documents, different weights, different paper. One thin, one heavier, official. She unfolded the thin one first because it was on top and because something in its lightness suggested it was meant to be read before the other. It was a letter. Short. Her father's handwriting, but different from the video. Looser, the pressure uneven, the hand of someone writing through pain or medication or both. The last months of his life, visible in every line. Aria. Margaret asked to be buried on the land. On the hill behind the house where the oak trees come together. She told me this years ago and I said yes, and then I let Brooklyn handle the arrangements when Margaret died, and Brooklyn made other decisions, and I didn't correct them because correcting them meant explaining things I hadn't explained yet. She's in a municipal cemetery on the east side, row 14. No visitors that I know of. I'm sorry I didn't fix this while I could still fix things. The second document will tell you the rest. I couldn't say it out loud on the video. Some things I could only write down once and leave for you to find. You deserved to know from the beginning. That was my failure, not yours. Never yours. Aria folded the letter carefully, placed it on the table, picked up the second document. It was official. Headed paper from a medical clinic, dated 9 years ago, notarized at the bottom. The language was clinical and precise in the way that documents are when they're trying to carry enormous weight without breaking under it. Paternity analysis, requested privately. Results confidential. She read the conclusion once. Then she sat very still in the folding chair in the orange light and read it again. The man who raised her was not her biological father. She had always known she was different from Thomas and Karen, not in the dramatic way of stories, not unloved, not mistreated, not visibly excluded, just different in the way a key is different from the lock it doesn't quite fit. The same general shape, not the right one. She had explained it to herself 100 different ways over the years, temperament, circumstance. The particular distance her father maintained that she had always attributed to his nature rather than to knowledge. But he had known. He had known for 9 years. The document named her biological father as a man she had never heard of, not anyone in the story she had been building all day, not Lucas or Jason or anyone connected to the estate. Just a name. A man her mother had apparently been involved with briefly during a period when her parents' marriage was, according to a note, her father had appended in his own handwriting at the bottom of the document, already privately over in every way that mattered. Her mother had never told him. He had found out through the test, and he had made a choice that Aria was only now understanding the full weight of. He had said nothing, had raised her, had loved her in the limited, complicated way he loved people, which was never effusive but was always present. And when it came time to divide what he had built, he had given his other children the things constructed on the compromised foundation. And he had given Aria the one thing that was clean, the house, the land, Margaret's property, transferred legally, registered properly, not because it was worthless, because it was the only honest thing he had to give. She sat with that for a long time. Outside, somewhere in the facility, a door rolled open, then closed, then footsteps on concrete. Not rushing, but deliberate. Moving along the rows with the patience of someone who knows where they're going. Aria stood up quietly. She put both documents back in the envelope. Put the envelope in her bag with the folder. Closed the third bin and replaced the lid on the second. Looked at the laptop, thought for 1 second, then unplugged it and tucked it under her arm. The footsteps stopped outside Unit 114. A pause, then a knock on the metal door. Casual, almost polite. Aria. Lucas's voice, controlled as always. I think we've reached the point where a conversation would benefit both of us considerably more than whatever you're planning to do next. She looked at the rolled-down door. Thought about her father in that folding chair, 8 months from dying, trying to leave a shape behind that someone could follow. Thought about Margaret in row 14 of a municipal cemetery, buried in the wrong place by people who found it convenient, waiting for someone to notice. Thought about Jason keeping a folder for 11 years because he couldn't fix the thing, but couldn't throw away the record of it either. Thought about Brooklyn setting out a second glass. Everyone in this story had been waiting for someone to do the thing that needed doing, and everyone had decided, for their own reasons, that they were not quite the right person to do it. She reached into her bag and found her phone. Called Jason. He answered in one ring. "I need you to call whoever you need to call at the county recorder's office," she said quietly. "The legitimate transfer of the forest property. I need it confirmed in the system before morning." "Already done," Jason said. "I did it 2 hours ago." She almost smiled. "And the communications in the third bin," she continued. "If I photograph everything tonight and send it to you, do you know an attorney who isn't Lucas Phillips and isn't afraid of Lucas Phillips?" "I know 3, Jason said. "I'll send everything within the hour." She hung up. Lucas knocked again, less casual this time. "Aria, the injunction gives me legal access to this unit at 8 a.m. Whatever you're doing in there, you're not changing the outcome." She picked up the folding chair, placed it in the center of the unit, sat down, facing the door, opened the third bin, started photographing, page by page, 11 years. Every exchange, every arrangement, every careful piece of a structure built on a divorce that was never filed and a silence that was never broken. The flash of her phone camera lit the unit in repeated bursts, methodical, unhurried. Lucas stopped knocking, which meant he was either leaving or deciding. Either way, she had work to do. She photographed for 40 minutes without stopping. When she was finished, she sent everything to Jason in 4 separate files and sat in the quiet of the storage unit with the laptop on her knees and the folder in her bag and the letter from her father in her pocket. Tomorrow there would be attorneys and phone calls, and whatever motion Lucas filed at 8 a.m. would meet a counter-motion that had been building since the moment her father pressed a handwritten address into a legal document and hoped she would be the one to follow it. But tonight she sat with the other thing. The thing that had nothing to do with property law or estate fraud or 11 years of documented manipulation. Her mother had never told her father. Her father had never told her. And Margaret, who had known somehow or suspected or simply recognized something in the photographs she had seen of the Campbell children over the years. Margaret had transferred the house to Aria anyway, without condition, without explanation in the letter, just the transfer and the photographs and the number on the back of an image and a sealed envelope that said, "Not yet." As if Margaret had understood that the house was never about property, it was about origin. Aria looked at the closed door of the storage unit, row 14 of a municipal cemetery on the east side. She knew what she was going to do first in the morning, before the attorneys, before the counter-motion, before any of it. She was going to find Margaret's grave, and she was going to tell her that someone had come. What do you think Aria should do? Pursue the legal case or let the truth speak for itself? Tell us what you'd choose. Aria found Margaret's grave at 7 in the morning, row 14, east side of the cemetery, close to the perimeter fence where the grass grew slightly longer and the maintenance crews apparently finished their rounds without quite reaching. The headstone was small, grey granite, the name, the years, nothing else. No epitaph, no flower holders, the kind of marker that gets chosen when nobody who loved the person is making the decisions. Aria stood there for a long time without speaking. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of Asheville autumn morning that feels freshly made, the mountains visible on the horizon with that particular blue clarity that only appears when the air is completely still. She had stopped at a gas station on the way and bought 2 coffees without thinking, and was only now registering that she was holding both of them. She set one on the base of the headstone, felt slightly foolish. did it anyway. She looked at the dates. Margaret had been 61 when she died, had lived in that house in the forest for most of her adult life, alone for the majority of it, teaching and keeping the property, and existing in the dignified, unperformed way that her letter had described, had discovered the truth about her own marriage through a land dispute, had contacted Jason, had chosen silence to protect children she had never met, had transferred a house to a girl whose name she knew but whose face she had only seen in photographs. Aria thought about that choice for a while, the specific weight of it. Choosing to protect someone from a truth while simultaneously leaving them every tool to find it, not deciding for Aria what the truth meant or what should be done with it, just ensuring that when Aria arrived, if Aria arrived, she would have everything she needed. That was not the act of a bitter woman. That was the act of someone who understood that the people coming after you deserve the full picture, not the edited version that makes the people who came before look better than they were. She drank her coffee, left Margaret's on the stone, drove to the law offices of an attorney named Claire Odom, whom Jason had called the previous night and who had agreed to see Aria at 8 a.m. with the words, "I've been waiting for someone to walk in with something on Lucas Phillips for about 4 years." Claire Odom was 50, precise, and had the demeanor of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people lied to her and had developed an acute sensitivity to the texture of truth. She read through the photographed documents on Aria's phone without speaking, occasionally returning to a page, occasionally making a note on the legal pad in front of her. When she finished, she set the phone down and looked at Aria. "This is sufficient," she said. "For what?" Aria said. "For most of what you might want to do." Claire leaned back. "The estate distribution is contestable. The property transfer to you is clean and defensible. The communications are enough to initiate a bar complaint against Phillips that he will not survive professionally." She paused, "and depending on how a judge reads the financial transfers made during the period of the undissolved marriage, there may be grounds for a broader challenge." "Thomas and Karen," Aria said. Claire nodded carefully. "They would be affected." Aria looked at the window, the mountains still visible through the glass, that same blue clarity. "I don't want to take anything from Thomas and Karen," she said. Claire waited. "What I want," Aria continued, "is Lucas Phillips to never practice law again. I want the property transfer confirmed and recorded. I want a formal petition submitted to move Margaret's remains to the land behind the house." She stopped. "And I want a letter sent to Thomas and Karen explaining what their father did and what Lucas did and why the estate they received is built on a foundation that they deserve to know about." She paused again. "Not to take it from them, just so they know, so they can decide for themselves what to do with that knowledge." Claire studied her. "That's a considered position," she said. "I've had a long night," Aria replied. The bar complaint was filed by noon. The petition for Margaret's remains was submitted to the county by 2 in the afternoon, accompanied by the property transfer documentation and a supporting letter from Claire Odom that was, by all accounts, extremely difficult to argue against. Lucas Phillips called Aria's phone 4 times between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. She didn't answer. At 3:15, he called Claire Odom's office instead. Claire's assistant reported afterward that the call lasted less than 2 minutes and that Mr. Phillips had not sounded like himself. The letters to Thomas and Karen went out by registered mail. Thomas called Aria that evening. She answered this time. He was quiet for the first few seconds. Then he said, "I didn't know." "I know," she said. "I need some time." "Take it." Karen didn't call, which was, Aria thought, exactly what Karen would do, and possibly the most honest thing Karen had ever communicated. 3 weeks later, on a morning that had turned properly cold, Aria drove back to the house in the forest. She had been there twice since the first visit. Once with a structural engineer who told her the foundation was sound and most of the frame was salvageable once alone, just to sit inside for an hour with the door open and the forest coming in around the edges. Today she came with work gloves and a truck she had borrowed from Jason and no plan beyond starting somewhere. She began with the porch, the collapsed side first, pulling away the rotted boards carefully, separating what could be saved from what couldn't, stacking the salvageable timber against the stone foundation. The work was slow and physical and required her complete attention, which was, she had discovered, exactly what she needed. No space for anything except the immediate problem of this board, this nail, this decision about whether this piece of wood had enough life left in it to be worth keeping. She worked for 4 hours without stopping. At some point in the early afternoon, she sat on the stone steps, intact, solid, the same stones that had been here since before her father was born, and looked at the clearing she had made. The progress was modest. The house was still largely a ruin. There were months of work ahead, possibly years, and she had no particular expertise and limited resources and a structural engineer's report that contained the phrase "significant undertaking" 3 separate times. She felt, sitting there with her hands dirty and her jacket torn at one elbow, more settled than she had felt in as long as she could remember. Her phone showed a message from Claire Odom. The petition for Margaret's remains had been approved. She read it twice. Then she walked around the side of the house and through the overgrown yard to the hill where the oak trees came together. The hill Margaret had named in her request. It was exactly what you'd expect from someone who had lived here long enough to know every part of the land. Not dramatic, not grand, just the right place. Trees old enough that the canopy closed above you and the light came through filtered and particular. Quiet in the specific way of places that have been undisturbed for a very long time. She stood there for a while. She was not a person who talked to empty spaces, but she found herself speaking anyway, quietly, without ceremony. She said, "I found it, all of it." She said, "I'm going to fix the house." She said, "I think you knew I would." The trees didn't answer. The light moved slightly as the canopy shifted in a small wind. Somewhere in the forest, a bird called once and then was silent. Aria stayed until the cold became something she couldn't ignore. Then she walked back down the hill, past the stone chimney still standing at the end of the ruined structure, past the stacked, salvageable timber, past the open door letting the forest in. She picked up her gloves and went back to work. She could have burned it all down. She chose to build instead. Was that the right call? Or would you have done it differently? Tell us below. Thank you for staying until the end. Every comment, every watch, every person who made it this far, it means everything. See you in the next story.